but we're going to get straight on here with bird flu.
Bird flu it is, yes, again, and to the seasoned UK column viewer, this will not come as a great surprise, but from the UK Health Security Agency, we've had what might seem like a very trivial announcement of somebody being ill in proximity to birds, but they're describing it as a case of bird-to-human avian flu in a person in the West Midlands, and they are at pains to say that the risk of avian flu to the general public remains very low, despite this confirmed case. Now, people will be having bells of deja vu ringing in their heads, I dare say. Circled at the bottom of this tweet, I have included the text, "Currently, there is no evidence of onwards transmission from this case," which I am labelling subject to change, because we've seen how these things can and will drift. Of course, this represents an enormous commercial opportunity, mostly for the pharmaceutical industry in terms of vaccinating or medicating not just poultry, but also human beings, also for the biosecurity industry as it stands insofar as introducing measures to not just places that keep poultry, but because there is a suggestion that this zoonotic capability means that in some senses anything is at threat. Therefore, of course, this could be wheeled out anywhere, potentially. And previously, and I say previously, which I will qualify in a second, for the food cartels, because this is introducing the notion of food scarcity and manipulation of the food chain. Now, as you see from the tweet, or did see from the tweet, the Health Security Agency using absurd, spurious language of non-scientific nature, like spillover, which of course has absolutely no veracity or scientific standing. Now, this is significant, I would contend, not because I'm wanting to reinforce the scaremongering narrative, but because of the parallels to the messaging that we received at the end of 2019 and early 2020. So dipping back into Hansard from the 23rd of January 2020, we had the Shadow Health Secretary Sharon Hodgson talking about a global pandemic which can be avoided. She said in the Commons that there is a chance that a global pandemic can be avoided if governments across the world take the right measures in a timely fashion. This is sort of what the UK HSA are saying now. On the very same day, Matt Hancock said, "Most cases of the new coronavirus so far have been non-fatal. In these cases, most people experience cold and flu-like symptoms and then recover. However, there have been a small number of cases so far where it has proven more serious and fatal." So the narrative, insofar as the pace and the use of what sounds like a fairly innocuous incident, has the potential to be blown up and up and up. Again, from January, if we go back to the timeline of 2020, the speed with which it developed was extraordinary. On the 29th, the family that had flown into the UK from China were reported to have fallen ill. The son called the NHS and declared that they had a fever and a cough and that they'd arrived from Hubei province. Now, the two paramedics dressed in hazmat arrived at the hotel, obviously very much over dramatic, necessarily so for the narrative to be developed accordingly. But an ambulance took them to a hospital in Hull and they were tested, and lo and behold, they were found to have the coronavirus. The very next day, on the 30th of January, the risk level was raised in the United Kingdom from low to moderate, and the World Health Organization declared that the pandemic, as it was described even then, was a global health emergency. So the point I'm making here is that it's very easy from one very simple illness that is confirmed, of course, by the extraordinarily spurious PCR test to develop this at speed if required, and indeed if the system is deemed ready for it. But of course, this, as I say, relies on the tests, and that's exactly what happened back in 2020. The Public Health England lab back in the northwest London confirmed that they had coronavirus. So the UK column line throughout this has been to examine the science, such as it is or such as it isn't, and to state that there is a complete lack of, an absence of evidence for the existence of avian influenza as a discernible illness. Further, there is no evidence for transmission in the way that it's being described by the Animal and Plant Health Agency, DEFRA, and the Health Security Agency too. But critically, like all of these things, It is being pushed very hard by the BBC. Now, the Farming Today programme earlier on today had an interview with a free-range poultry farmer, a free-range egg farmer, and he set out the very faulty logic contained within the countermeasures insofar as biosecurity is concerned. So we'll just have a quick listen to what he said.
It's about as near as we'd like to get, really, for biosecurity reasons.
Well, we're standing a good distance from the sheds where David Perrone has his layers.
I think the argument for housing can be odd because the biggest case so far has been in Shropshire, and that was all housed birds because they were barn eggs. And it makes the argument for housing weaker.
I hit the nail on the head there, because by the government's own metrics or own logic, which is to keep birds inside in the event of such an illness confirmed by PCR, this man is stating that, of course, these birds were already inside. Now, as we know well, no account of the environmental conditions of birds or their feed or their water is ever tested. This I have in black and white from APHA by a Freedom of Information request. Nevertheless, BBC Farming Today pushed it further by speaking to an epidemiologist, a veterinary one, Professor James Wood from Cambridge, and this is what he had to say in terms of confirming whether or not farm workers should feel worried about it.
So should farm workers on poultry units be worried about this?
I think in general terms, no. If an outbreak of bird flu is notified to the authorities, then they will be providing very specific advice around the sort of personal protection, the PPE that people should be wearing if they have to go anywhere near the birds. So in general terms, I don't think this is something that poultry workers should be worried about, but everyone should be aware that this is something that could happen.
Now, what he also said in response to a question was that this cannot be passed from human to human. So we're in the position now of being expected to believe that a virus exists that can be passed amongst wild birds. It can be passed from a wild bird to domestic poultry and back again. It can be passed between domestic poultry, and it can be passed from domestic poultry to a human being. But somehow it's unable to go from a human being to a human being, unless, of course, it mutates. And of course, I refer back to the case last year where we were told that even bird flu had travelled to the South Atlantic to infect elephant seals. So that there are holes in this narrative a mile wide, but the likelihood is that the population will believe this, which is why it's a significant problem. Now, the epidemiologist, James Wood, did at least have the decency to say that this is different from the variant or the version in the United States, which he cited as having conjunctivitis as a symptom, which makes one wonder, of course, why it's not just referred to as conjunctivitis. But because of the proximity to animals, it has a zoonotic label slapped on it. And there we go. Now, the central message to the BBC's output this morning was to suggest to people, don't think that it can't happen to you. And this is very redolent of the narrative that was put out for the coronavirus confection back in early 2020. And it does represent corruption across the board, not just the science, which is totally without foundation, but by their own logic, the countermeasures are known to be pointless. The environmental conditions, as I say, are never considered or assessed. And it's a complete corruption for the consumer who has had the regulations changed, which means that they'll still be able to buy eggs labelled as free range, even when they're not. So that 16 rule has gone. And of course, this lays the door open for further food scarcity and ties in with that narrative driven towards the suggestion that it's all to do with climate change. And indeed, DEFRA is very keen to point out that in the scheme of things, that the destruction or the culling, as they say, the humane culling of these birds is proportionate to the 20 million that are slaughtered each week for human consumption. So the figures, just in order to make it clear how the PCR test drives this, are that to date, there are 24 cases, or 25 across the two strains they claim to have identified. These are not deaths, these are PCR cases. And as was pointed out in the last news broadcast where I referred to this, there are approximately 9,500 slaughtered birds per discerned case by PCR. So the point to draw out here is that the government is well primed for the inflation of this particular narrative to drive people towards biosecurity panic and the sense of emergency, and the 5 million doses of stockpiled vaccine for humans made by CSL Seqirus, which of course we've reported on in the past. So this will certainly be something to keep a very close eye on, and the only hope really is that following the years of coronavirus propaganda, that the expected audience will have fallen foul of fatigue of the story, but we shall see which way it goes.
Thank you, Charles.